What if we told you that one time the United States government intentionally rained radioactive material down onto its own cities? It sounds like the premise to a cheesy 50s sci-fi movie, but it's actually true. And to make things even weirder, it wasn't some kind of Cold War accident. This was part of a top-secret program called Operation LAC, or Operation Long Air Campaign, which saw nuclear fallout dumped over 23 major cities in the US between 1951 and 1958. But why? Keep watching to find out. It all started back in 1949 when the Soviet Union successfully tested their first atomic bomb. Up until that point, the United States had enjoyed a monopoly on nuclear weapons. So the news that the Soviets now possessed this terrifying technology came as quite a shock. Suddenly, an arms race was on, and the US government found itself in a race against time to develop new and better weapons. One of the projects that was initiated during this time was Operation Castle, which involved a series of 21 nuclear tests conducted between 1954 and 1958 at the Pacific Proving Grounds in what is now known as the Marshall Islands. During this time, a total of 67 nuclear devices were detonated with one of the largest blasts, Castle Bravo, occurring on March 1, 1954. Castle Bravo was supposed to be a 6-megaton bomb, but it ended up exploding with around 15 megatons of destructive power. As a result, it became the second most powerful nuclear weapon ever detonated by the US after the 23-megaton Ivy Mike device tested 3 years earlier on November 1952. Castle Bravo also inadvertently caused the nuclear fallout to drift dangerously off course. A total of 23 people who were directly involved in the testing received fatal doses of radiation, and more than 100 others suffered from radiation sickness. However, this didn't stop the US government from proceeding with Operation Long Air Campaign, which was a plan to deliver nuclear warheads via aircraft. Operation Oak was divided into two parts. In the first phase, which lasted from June to September 1955, the military wanted to see how well bombs could be delivered from a B-29 bomber at low altitudes. The second phase, which took place the following year, was designed to study the effects of high-altitude nuclear detonations. On July 22, 1955, B-29 bombers took off from the US Air Force Base in Guam and flew to Johnston Island in the Marshall Islands, where they released their nuclear warheads and then flew back to Guam. At this point, the US government thought that they had everything under control. However, on August 25, 1955, President Dwight D. Eisenhower was informed that Operation Long Air Campaign Phase 2 would need to be delayed due to the lack of suitable targets in the Marshall Islands. Now, the military needed somewhere else to carry out their tests, and they didn't have to look too far because soon they found the perfect candidate, the continental United States. On October 1955, a meeting was held at the Pentagon involving officials from the Atomic Energy Commission, the Federal Civil Defense Administration, and the US Air Force. It was decided that the second phase of Operation Long Air Campaign would take place over the United States. And just like that, Operation LAC was born. The plan was for 8 B-29 bombers to fly from the US Air Force Base in Casper, Wyoming to the Nevada test site located around 60 miles northwest of Las Vegas, Nevada. There the planes would release their nuclear payloads and return to base. However, the project was plagued with problems right from the start. For example, the first aircraft to take off on October encountered mechanical issues and had to turn back. Another plane had to be diverted to Rapid City, South Dakota, after it experienced a malfunction with its autopilot system. Then the weather got bad and the military had no choice but to cancel the mission. They tried again the next day, but the problems continued. While flying over Casper, one of the planes lost all of its hydraulic fluid and had to return to base. With only 5 planes left, the military once again attempted to take off, but they had no sooner reached Montana than they were forced to turn back once more. After several failed attempts, the military decided to try conducting the test on November. However, bad weather yet again disrupted the mission, and it was until December 1955 that the operation was finally successful. 5 of the 6 planes released their warheads over Nevada, while the remaining aircraft dropped its payload over Utah. As it turned out, the whole thing was something of an anticlimactic dud. Each of the 6 devices that were dropped contained only 1.2 kilograms of plutonium-238, and none of them exploded. Instead, they merely released small amounts of radioactive particles into the air. But that wasn't the end of the operation. From January to March 1956, the U.S. military conducted for more tests as part of Operation LAC. On January, 3 planes dropped their payloads over Arkansas, and 1 plane dropped its payload over Oklahoma. On February, 2 planes dropped their payloads over Florida, and 1 did the same over Louisiana. On March, another plane released its payload over Arizona. This meant that between December 1955 and March 1956, the United States government intentionally spread radioactive material over 23 different states. And despite the name of the operation, it wasn't just Nevada that was affected. Other locations where radioactive material was dumped included St. Louis, Missouri, Wichita Falls, Texas, Columbus, Ohio, Port Clinton, New York, and Fort Wayne, Indiana. At the time, there were serious concerns about the potential health risks associated with exposure to fallout. It was already known that radiation could cause cancer and other diseases, but there was very little understanding of the long-term effects. Nevertheless, the U.S. government proceeded with the tests and dumped radioactive material over major cities, putting millions of people at risk. According to official documents, the devices used in Operation LAC were only capable of releasing small amounts of radiation. However, according to other sources, the actual amount of radiation released during the tests was much higher than what the government was led to believe. The bombs had been designed to be dropped from low altitudes, so the radiation would have a greater impact on the ground. But they were instead dropped from much higher altitudes, which would have resulted in a larger blast radius. Moreover, the military failed to adequately monitor the fallout, which made it difficult to assess the potential risks to human health. After the final test in March 1956, the U.S. government decided to call off the remainder of Operation Long Air Campaign. They then began to clean up the mess and relocate the contaminated equipment to the Nevada test site. But before they knew it, they were being sued by local residents who claimed that they had been exposed to dangerous levels of radiation. To make matters worse, the government's cleanup efforts were so ineffective that large amounts of radioactive material were left behind. In fact, it's estimated that around 200,000 square kilometers of land in Nevada is still contaminated today. In the decades since Operation LAC, there have been numerous reports of increased rates of cancer and other diseases in areas where the nuclear tests were conducted. Of course, it's impossible to say whether or not these health problems are linked to the nuclear fallout, but it's a worrying coincidence nonetheless. To this day, the US government has refused to acknowledge that Operation LAC ever happened. In fact, they went to great lengths to cover up the truth, destroying documents and harassing witnesses. It wasn't until 1990 that the full story was finally revealed. Since then, there have been calls for a full investigation into the health effects of Operation LAC, but the US government has resisted these calls, perhaps because they don't want to admit that they put their own citizens at risk. Or perhaps they're worried about the implications for national security. After all, if it became known that the US government is willing to nuke its own cities, then it would make the country much less safe. Whatever the reason, the US government has yet to come clean about Operation LAC, and as a result, many questions remain unanswered. What exactly was the purpose of the operation? How much radiation was actually released? And what effect did it have on the people who were exposed? Until the US government is willing to come clean, we may never know the full story of Operation LAC. But one thing is for sure, this dark chapter in American history should never be forgotten. The idea of the US government intentionally nuking its own cities is enough to send shivers down anyone's spine. And it's a sobering reminder of the dangers of nuclear weapons. In the aftermath of World War II, the US government was eager to demonstrate its military might and develop new weapons to ensure its dominance. However, the consequences of Operation LAC show that unchecked ambition can lead to dangerous and harmful outcomes. In conclusion, Operation LAC was a top-secret program that saw the United States government dump radioactive material over 23 cities in the US between 1951 and 1958. Although it was intended to study the effects of nuclear fallout, the program put millions of people at risk of exposure to dangerous levels of radiation. The long-term health effects of this exposure are still unknown, but it is possible that it contributed to increased rates of cancer and other diseases in the affected areas. Despite the risks, the US government proceeded with Operation LAC without fully understanding the potential consequences. The program was eventually canceled in 1956 after public outcry, and the US government has since tried to cover up its involvement. Operation LAC is a reminder of the dangers of nuclear weapons and the importance of transparency in government. By learning from past mistakes, we can work to prevent such harmful actions from happening again in the future.